most of chapter 18 when we talked about Elijah and his confrontation with the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. And really what we have here in chapter 19, I think, is a moment of frustration, brokenness. I would say in some ways giving up in one focus, not in his failure to want to please God and to honor God, but I think in Elijah's almost, how would you say, his feeling that he can't accomplish the task that's set before him. I think that's kind of the picture that I see in the beginning of chapter 19. And I think we made it down to about verse 8, and we have Elijah headed down to Mount Horeb. And obviously, so I don't have a perfect map here, but we've got Mount Carmel up here where he was, makes his way over to Jezreel, and then he'll go all the way south down to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb for this encounter with God. I think it's very important. I think it helps us a lot to kind of compare what's going on with Elijah to what was going on with Moses. You've got 40 days of fasting. You've got both of them up on this Mount of the Covenant. I think all of that is important as we look at what happens. So what I'd like to do is read verses 9 through 18, and then we'll try to have some thoughts from the text. So there he came to a cave and lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And he said, "Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He said, "I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only am left, and they seek my life to take it away." And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." All right, so when the Lord asks Elijah what he's doing, what do we get? What's Elijah's response? And he responds this way basically identically twice, but what's his response?
His big response was that Israel has sinned, and I'm the only one left.
Yes. Now, why, let me see if I can phrase this in a good way. Why would it be that Elijah would go this place, and why would the Lord, who already knows the answer, ask Elijah here, what you doing here, Elijah? What do you think is going on at this place with the Lord asking this person, what's going on? Why are you here?
He's actually stressing the point to him. Why did you come down here? I mean, I'm everywhere, so why did you have to come to this mountain to talk to me?
Okay, I have a different take on it, right? The reason I have a different take on it is because in chapter 19 and verse 8, verse 7, the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." It looks to me like the angel wants him to do some journeying, right? And then he arose, ate and drank, and went in the strength of that food, the food that the angel had provided for the journey, right? For whatever journey's ahead, this is what the angel is providing it for. 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the Mount of God. Interesting that it's identified as that, the Mount of God. and maybe we're reading too much into this for me to just leave the question just out there. But I think what you have here is at the place where the covenant was made, you have official charges being brought that the covenant has been vastly broken, right? This is covenant accusation. This is basically Elijah coming before the Lord, and I think it's Elijah saying, my work wasn't successful, the covenant has been broken, so what would that mean? Ultimately, I think it's a call for judgment. Right? It's a call for God to bring down the judgment. Now, God, I think, is listening to this and realizes that it's in some ways appropriate in this. He's going to give some qualifications and some clarification in kind of the the fire and the earthquake and the whisper. I think that teaches us something. But I think the Lord is on board with this covenant accusation and the judgment that it's going to deserve. What do you think? Okay. He said no, and I was like, oh no.
No, I thought you was going to say, do I have anything?
Okay. Now, I think that there is an emphasis that Elijah makes on your altars and your prophets that have been killed. I think that God's purpose in having Elijah and Mount Horeb together was to bring the covenant accusation against Israel for breach of covenant. Right? This is kind of an official charge being brought by a man of God at the place where the covenant was made originally. Now, in this intermediate scene where the Lord brings fire, right, and then the earthquake, and the text tells us, a wind and earthquake, and the Lord is not there. Right? I think that the lesson here is that he is not in what we might think of as the spectacular and impressive all the time. Right? That God does not always intervene in a way where everybody would say, well, obviously, this is the Lord at work here. That sometimes what he does is he speaks his word and allows it to bear itself out, and that's the great evidence of himself through history, even if there's not some mighty, tremendous act. I think that's what we're going to see in the passages where he talks about Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha. It almost seems to me that what Elijah would expect for the right response to be would be something like an earthquake in Israel, or maybe some kind of cataclysmic catastrophe. And the Lord says, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be my word being fulfilled over time. And that's what we're going to see at the end of the paragraph, and then we'll see the beginnings of that here as he begins to appoint a prophet. Okay. Anything so far about all that? All right. So the response from God to Elijah the second time after he gives that response is, first of all, return on your way. I think he's saying get back to work. Right? There's still more for you to do. Then he's going to appoint Hazael, and the history of this is going to actually even expand beyond Elijah's lifetime. All right, so let's not be confused on the chronology here. Hazael will actually be directly appointed by Elisha, but Elijah will appoint Elisha, who will appoint Hazael. Is Elisha, is that confusing enough for all of us? All right, so Elijah will appoint Elisha, who will go and will appoint Hazael in Damascus. So it will still be, by extension, in the work of Elijah. We'll get there later. I'm just saying it now so that we're not, terribly confused. And then Jehu will not be appointed until 2 Kings chapter 9, and that kind of works out the same way. But in order to get that process started, we'll have the appointing of who will be Elijah's successor, and that is Elisha, and that'll start in just a moment. Okay, and what these people will do is they will be the source of God's justice. They will be the source of God's judgment. So Elijah comes to the mountain bringing an accusation. They have broken the covenant, and God says, it's not going to be in some cataclysmic way that maybe Elijah would like to see, but I will take care of it. I will take care of it through Elisha, Hazael, Jehu, right? And that's often the way that God operates is if we didn't have this passage, I think we'd probably look at the rise of Hazael and not think another thing about it. But now we look at the rise of Hazael and we say, this is not just some random Syrian king. This is God's judgment at work. We might look at the rise of Jehu if we didn't have the biblical text and say, well, it's just another Israelite dynasty. No, this is God's work in bringing judgment. Now, does it have the same flash as like the flood or Sodom and Gomorrah? No. But that's not always how God operates, is it? Sometimes God operates in judgment. Often, I would say the vast majority of time, his judgment is through what looks like the normal workings of the world. But in this case, it's specifically in response to his prophecy and his word that he's going to be the one to bring this about. I hope that wasn't too muddying. What do you think? You want to clarify some of that for everybody? Any questions about that, maybe?
So I want to know.
Yeah.
I'm curious then. I don't think you've talked about this yet, but so why does God say, but there's 7,000 and still not?
Yeah, I think that is a reminder for Elijah that Elijah's view is, let's get this done now. And so maybe there is like, I wouldn't say it, I wouldn't say it's a, like, oh, well, it's all okay because I've still got 7,000. I think it is for Elijah at this particular moment. Elijah thinks there's nothing else that can be done. There's no hope for these people. And I think the Lord would say, yeah, for the vast majority of them, judgment's coming. But there is a remnant there. And that's how, so I like that. Thank you for asking that question because I should have said this. Paul actually quotes this passage that there are 7,000 have not knelt the knee to Baal. Actually quotes that passage in Romans 11 and says God's plan has always been that there would be a remnant of people. And I really think, and this is, I'm studying the book of Romans on my own right now, getting ready for some things, and I would say that Romans 9 through 11, this question about who's going to be saved to Israel or the Gentiles and how does all that, I think it's more at the core of the book than maybe I had given it credit for before. And in Romans 11, what Paul is saying is, it has never been everybody who was Jewish descent. It's never been all blood Israelites that were saved. It's always been those who were faithful. Faithfulness has always been the key. So I think in Paul's day, there were some ethnically descended Jews who had met their conditions, right? They'd been circumcised, they kept the Sabbath, they were eating the food appropriately, and they thought, well, you got to do all this to be in the group, right? If you want to come to Christ, you got to come to us first. Like Acts 15, right? You got to be circumcised first. And I think what Paul is saying is it's never been about ethnic descent. It's always been about whether or not you are devoted to the Lord. And in those days, in Paul's days and in our days, it's already devoted to Christ. And that's what makes a difference. And so it is helpful that Paul quotes this passage because it gives us this idea that all along in Israelite history, we never ought to think, I think Paul's saying, well, all the Israelites are going to be saved. No, it was the people who were really faithful to the Lord. That's who Israel really was all along. Okay.
I think too, I go along with all of what you just said, but I also think that when Elijah actually asked the question to God, I'm the only one.
Mm-hmm.
And then God tells him, there's 7,000. He tells him twice. I think it's kind of like a conversation with Job when he went to God and he said, I want to talk to you. I can really let you know what's all going on. And then God tells him, where were you when I created all these events of when earth and everything was created? Where were you at? You're nothing. I know everything. I'm God. And I think he was trying to convey that same issue to Elijah, even though he was his servant and that he was a prophet for God and that he was going to carry out his duty. God is actually putting him in place that, hey, there's more people that you don't even know about because I'm God and you're just one person.
Yeah.
I like that what you said earlier about Israel because I think about some of the misunderstandings I had about Scripture, I guess, growing up, and I always thought well, if you were a Jew or an Israelite, then you were good.
Yeah.
Even though the ones that were not, good people, I'm sure along the way I've figured out
Yeah.
something about that. But it's always been, let's say, in the New Testament talks about being a child or a descendant of Abraham.
Yeah.
It's always been, and what was Abraham like?
Yeah.
It goes back to that.
Yeah, and that's what he uses to determine who's a real descendant of Abraham, not blood type or DNA, but whether or not they. So I think one great passage is Jesus talking in John 8, where he says, "Actually, you're of your father, the devil." So who do you act like? So one thing that I would say is I think that there is a sense in which all Israelites were part of the covenant, right? There was an agreement that had been made with Israel and obviously with Judah, which would be more, I think, eventually becomes what we would think of as Israel for sure. That there was something about being a part of that covenant that was a benefit for everybody who was part of it. I don't know what that says necessarily about their eternal soul, right? And I think that may be the very point that Paul is making, is that it was always those who turned to the Lord, not just those who happen to have the law. So I think about the end of Romans 2, when Paul says that if you're circumcised but you don't live, like if you don't have a circumcised heart, it doesn't benefit you any. And if you're uncircumcised, these Gentiles who are coming in and they're Christians, they're not circumcised, but they get the benefit of it. It is as if they were, but of the heart, and because they're being loyal to Jesus. Okay, very good. And so you see you see both a recognition. God knows those who are His, right? Those 7,000. I wonder if some of them felt like Elijah, like God doesn't even see us. But God says, I got 7,000. I can see them even in an unfaithful world. I can see the 7,000 out of the, I don't know how many were in Israel at the time. If there's a million, right? He says, I can see my 7,000 in the million. And then you also have the promise of judgment. Judgment is coming on the wicked. And those are themes that we see repeated in the New Testament. And then we come to the calling of Elisha. You want to take us to that, or you just, would that be okay? You want to take us to it?
So, well, let me just read it. He departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen in front of him, and he was with the 12th. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him, and he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, Let me kiss my father and my mother, then I will follow you. And he said to him, Go back again, for what have I done to you? And he returned from following him and took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the yokes of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he arose and went after Elijah and assisted him. So he leaves heading towards Damascus. They meet up. Elijah makes the call there and to Elisha by putting his coat on him. It does not mention that there's a word said, but Elisha knows what's going on, and he wants to tell his family goodbye, and Elijah tells him to do so and come back because a great honor has been placed upon him. And he goes to tell them. He used the yokes to cook the oxen. What a great example to me of self-denial, self-sacrifice that is. Christians are called to deny self and take up their cross and follow Jesus. And that's what I see in that. How you want to say any more about it?
Well, I would just compare it to Luke 9:61. Do you remember the story where Jesus calls the man and he says, I will follow you, Lord, but first let me say farewell to those who are at home. Jesus said to him, no one who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. And I think some people look at that and say, well, that's what Elisha did, and Elisha was okay. Like, he went back to say goodbye to the people at home, and now Jesus is not letting this guy go back and say goodbye to the people at home. And I think what we see there is, of course, the Lord is not being hypocritical by inspiring a story of somebody who does this in faithfulness in the Old Testament and Jesus being overly mean about it in the New Testament. But what we have here is Elisha's going back for a different purpose than I think the man in Luke 9 was going back. Elisha is going back not to stay. He's going back to sever the bond, and he is like literally by doing what he does to his oxen, he's literally putting his hand to the plow and not looking back. Oddly enough, he's actually destroying his whole plow situation. But he's in the spiritual sense, he's saying he doesn't just sell the oxen or give somebody else control of them until he comes back. No, they're slaughtered, they're fed to the people. He's not going back to that anymore. Right? And so I think Elisha is a perfect picture of somebody who puts their hand to the spiritual plow and doesn't look back, even though we might not understand what's going on here, which I think indicates to us that the man that Jesus calls in Luke 9, Jesus can see something deeper in him and say, you're not interested in really following me. You want some excuse about why you don't have to commit fully right now, and shows the importance of making that firm commitment.
Elisha done away with his old way of life.
Yes, he's making a total break. That's right. Okay, you want to take us through chapter 20?
Okay, we'll just I'll just summarize it, and you can we'll do the first 12 verses. Ben-Hadad, the king of Syria, he decides he wants to take over Israel, and they surround Samaria, and he tells Ahab that he wants his silver and his gold and his wives and his children, and Ahab agrees to it. You know, what can I do about it? But Ben-Hadad, he gets a little greedy, or more greedy, and he tells Ahab that he will conduct a search and he's going to take all the personal valuables that they have. And Ahab doesn't want to go along with that. So he gets the elders together and to see how they feel about it. No, we're not going to do that. Ahab tells him that he cannot do the search. So Ben-Hadad swears that he will destroy Samaria, that there will be nothing left. Ahab tells him that he didn't need to be boasting as if he had already won the battle. And when Ben-Hadad heard this, he commanded the men to get ready to fight. You want to say any more on that?
I have nothing to add. I have a map. Damascus is here. It is this darker orange line. It's a little bit harder to see, but that darker orange line is what we're looking at for Ben-Hadad. So Ben-Hadad, you'll notice earlier when we were talking about Baasha and Asa, that king's name was Ben-Hadad as well. I assume this is an heir, or it's just a like kingly title sort of thing, but it's just a pass down. This is another person, not the same one. All right.
Okay, starting in verse 13. God sends a prophet with a message to Ahab that he, talking about God, will defeat the great army that Ben-Hadad has, so that Ahab will know that God is the Lord. And Ahab only has 7,000 men to fight. And they attack Ben-Hadad, and his army is driven out, and they suffer a great loss. Ben-Hadad gets away there. The prophet comes back and tells Ahab that Ben-Hadad will be back in the springtime. And Ben-Hadad goes and gets advice from his officers, tells them that the gods of Israel only rule in the mountains where they fought and lost. They tell him, you know, this time we need to fight in the valley, and we need to let our military men command the battle rather than the 32 kings. And well, you got anything on that? We're fixing to find out more about that fighting in the plain.
Yeah, I just one little thing is maybe it's not a little thing. Notice how many opportunities Ahab is being given to respond to direct evidence that Yahweh is God and not Baal or the gods of the Syrians or whoever else he might be tempted to listen to. Carson asked the other night, like, why is Ahab's reign so long? And I don't know. I wonder, you know, there's just so many opportunities being presented as opportunities for repentance. And maybe this was a moment in which the Lord saw, and I think we see this some in Ahab, that there's perhaps a glimmer of hope in there that the Lord is trying to tie into. Ultimately, Ahab will reject him overall, but perhaps this is a moment of the Lord making an appeal over and over and over to him.
It may go back to that limping back and forth.
That's exactly right. Yeah, if they're in a limping moment and not fully settled, going one direction, then he's going to try to prove it to him. And Ahab does kind of listen here, right? He is responding positively to the instructions that the Lord has given him, and doing things that would look maybe unwise or even risky in other circumstances. But I don't know that he's trusting the Lord as much as he is. He's willing to take advantage of this moment for his own personal success. And so maybe he could learn, is maybe the idea.
All right. Verses 26 through 34 there. The spring battle is about to begin, and Israel's army looks like it's two small flocks of goats compared to the Syrian army. It says that they filled the land. And a man of God comes to Ahab, tells him that God resents the Syrian statement that he only rules in the mountains, and tells Ahab that they will defeat the Syrians so that everyone will know that he is the Lord wherever you are. And they do. They defeat Ben-Hadad, but he runs and hides. And his servants tell him that they heard that the kings of Israel were merciful, so they beg for their lives. And when Ahab finds out that Ben-Hadad is still alive, he calls him brother. That amazes me. Why? Why would he do that? Why would Ahab call this enemy a brother?
One thing might be is he might think this helps build his prominence.
There's something in it.
There's something in it for him. That's right.
Something to be gained, and he does gain something from it, because Ben-Hadad promises to give him the cities and control of the trade in Damascus, and so Ahab sets him free.
And Marcy Allen has a question.
Yeah.
Is there a connection between the 7,000 faithful and what goes out to fight?
That is a good question. I have never thought of that before until this moment. I would guess that it is.
I read
Yeah.
one commentary that did mention that, and
Just thought of the two numbers together, but
yeah, one said that they were these 7,000 the same
Yeah.
7,000 faithful, and I just said I don't know about that.
I would assume they're not the same. There is something about the number 7,000 though that is representative, but I want to be careful because I would not conclude that this is just a made up number to make a representative point, right? Like 7,000, wink, wink, like everybody knows 7,000 just means a complete number. I would say it was literally 7,000 people, but maybe it is pointing to something. Maybe the fact that number is being included, that the Lord is using it in that way, that the script, that just God's providence works out so that it is 7,000 in both cases to see a full number. It's possible that even the number 7,000 is representative in some sense when you think about like the faithful. Like maybe there were more than 7,000 people, but 7,000, God knows all of those that are his. That's how we would use it in the book of Revelation. But in this, I would say probably more historically accurate, precise even. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so often the 7 and the 1,000 together represents completeness. Yeah, at least in Revelation. Now, so I would say that Elijah. Let me say this: apocryphal literature, like the Book of Revelation, is a much later development, and I mean that both biblically and historically. Like the vast majority of what we have as like representative numbers language comes after Return and Rebuilding, because there was a lot of it that was written secularly as well. So like the book of Daniel, Ezekiel and Daniel is really kind of the first like apocryphal writing we have. And then we don't really have it much again I mean, there's some in Zechariah, but you know what I mean. We don't have a lot until we get to Revelation again. There's a lot of it produced by Jewish society. But I wouldn't, in my thinking, I wouldn't put 1st and 2nd Kings in that genre. I would put it in a different historical genre, not in literature that's intended to use numbers to represent something else.
I just thought the number 7,000 there was
Yeah.
just a comparison to who they were going up against.
Yes.
Because we see that several times.
Yeah, I will say this, that sometimes they do point out details like that because it helps make the story easier to remember, but they're true. For example, this is way off the subject, but it's Alan's fault. So, just kidding, Alan. What I would say is, remember the woman who had the issue of blood in this is Mark 8. Remember how long she had the issue of blood? It's 12 years. The way I remember that is because Jairus' daughter, you know how old she was? She was 12 years old, right? So Mark tells that story within a story. Now, he doesn't have to tell us how long or how old either one is, but he notes both those in that account. And so we kind of have that numerical connection. And maybe that's kind of what's going on here, is it does create a numerical connection. I'm not making any point by that other than just saying, now we can remember there were 7,000 faithful and there were 7,000 Ahab soldiers sent against Syria. Yes. Oh, yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah, because you're going to have and I would have guessed that would have included some of the 7,000 that hadn't knelt the knee to Baal would probably have included some of those. I don't know that that's what Alan was asking. I think he was just asking if there was a connection between them. I don't think he was saying, are they the same? I guess it could have been, but we don't know. We're not given that information, so.
For the different events over the course of time, when God actually has inspired writers to actually give a total number against a larger number,
Yeah.
that if God would with them, there would be no way that smaller group of people against such a large number in a nation could defeat them.
That's right. Yeah, so there's lots of examples of that kind of thing, right? You got Gideon's 300 or Ahab 7,000 or David 1 versus 9'9" Goliath or whatever. I don't know how tall David was, so I can't make that numerical comparison. But anyway, all that is to say is I don't know that there's any more connection than just that they both happen to be 7,000. All right. Okay, now just looking at this last section, I think it'd be quicker for me to just
All right.
read. You want to read it?
I can read it.
That'd be great.
And a certain man of the sons of the prophets said to his fellow at the command of the Lord, strike me, please. But the man refused to strike him. Then he said to him, because you have not obeyed the voice of the Lord, behold, as soon as you have gone from me, a lion shall strike you down. And as soon as he had departed from him, a lion met him and struck him down. Then he found another man and said, strike me, please. And the man struck him and wounded him. So the prophet departed and waited for the king by the way, disguising himself with a bandage over his eyes. And as the king passed, he cried to the king and said, your servant went out into the midst of the battle, and behold, a soldier turned and brought a man to me and said, guard this man. If by any means he is missing, your life shall be for his life, or else you shall pay by a talent of silver. And as your servant was busy here and there, he was gone. The king of Israel said to him, so shall your judgment be. You yourself have decided it. Then he hurried to take the bandage away from his eyes, and the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. And he said to him, thus says the Lord, because you have let go out of your hand the man whom I had devoted to destruction, therefore your life shall be for his life, and your people for his people. And the king of Israel went to his house, vexed and sullen, and came to Samaria.
All right. Okay. This isn't, I was going to say weird, but I don't think you can say that at the Bible. But it catches me off guard when I read this story. I'll say that. That is, notice what the command is. The Lord commands this man to go up to somebody else and say, strike me, please. Now, if I said that to Lydia, that the Lord said to strike me, she would follow through. She would be the obedient person here. But almost everybody else, I think we would say, whoa, no, I don't know about that, And the first person the prophet, who I think is talking to at least to another prophet, a certain man, the prophet said to his fellow, the man, it's not identified as a prophet, but maybe he's supposed to know that this is the word of the Lord speaking to him, because when he rejects it, he's rejected the word of the Lord, and there's going to be consequences for him. Then he goes to another, and he is struck, and that man was actually obedient to the instruction of the Lord. But that's just the preview. That's just the preface, right? This man now has been struck pretty severely. So he puts bandages over, and so what is he supposed to look like as he makes his way towards King Ahab? He's supposed to look like an injured soldier, right? So he tells a story as if he was actually an injured soldier, and he had a prisoner that he was supposed to be keeping an eye on. He did not, so he would be rewarded for holding on to him, but he would be punished if he lost him. And what is Ahab's response to the fact that this man says, I've lost him? You get what you deserve. No mercy for him, judgment coming down. And then the man takes the bandages off his eyes, and what does Ahab realize? This is a man of God. He was telling what I might think of as a parable or an allegory or something like that. And what does the man say that Ahab has done? He had been entrusted with holding on to a captive, and he had let him go. This reminds me a lot of David's interaction with Nathan. Nathan tells a story about a man who had taken his neighbor's lone sheep, and David says, he deserves death, right? That's what Ahab says, right? Judgment's coming down on you. You don't get any mercy. And it's basically like the man pulling off his bandages and saying, thou art the man, right? You're the one. This was just a story to illustrate. And that's, Brother Tom Holly would always point out, this is the beauty of parables, because we can see the truth before we see ourselves in it, right? We see the truth, and then when it's pointed to us and we say, oh, that's talking about you. That's talking about me. It's like, oh, I was able to draw the right conclusion when it wasn't personal, and now I can make it personal. So what he's doing is he's saying, Ahab, you failed. Now, he failed in letting Ben-Hadad go. Ben-Hadad, God had devoted destruction. I think this is a really interesting passage, because here is a judgment that God had intended to bring, and yet he allowed that judgment to be dependent on whether or not Ahab would be obedient or not. And so God's will, in one sense, is not accomplished. Now, ultimately, in the grand scheme of things, God's will be accomplished. But he had given Ahab the free choice to decide whether or not he was going to participate in that, and Ahab does not. Ahab would rather, I think, and as we made mention earlier, I think would rather have had the worldly standing of association with Ben-Hadad II in Syria than he cared about being right with the Lord. So all along the way, we're going to say moments where Ahab is like, well, he's getting it right here, right? He's following the Lord's instructions about sending armies against Syria and all that. And then he misses it, because Ahab is the kind of guy who over and over and over, for various and sundry reasons, whether it's Jezebel, whether it's his desire for prominence, whether it's his own self-pity or whatever it might be, fails to follow through on what the Lord instructs him to do. He's like, it's almost like he's so close, and then he's so far away. And so, that's right. No, it seems to me that he trusts him mostly at moments where it's a benefit to trust him. It always is. Maybe I should say that. It's always the benefit. But when he can see the earthly payoff for trusting the Lord, he says, okay, we'll go that route. And then if it's going to be an earthly cost, like, no, I don't want to go that direction. And that's kind of the world we live in, right? Where there are times where it's convenient to obey the Lord, right? We don't want to be immoral scoundrels because that might lose us business connections or something like that. But, if we have to do something to get a business connection, then we might do something kind of in the back door. And that kind of thinking is what I see in Ahab. Ahab, who knows enough about the Lord to say, well, here's some ways that's going to help me, but then is not committed to it in the moments where it's going to cost him. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we'll see this phrase, vexed and sullen,
Well, I was thinking to ask what was the difference between the reaction of David and his. David repents.
I'm so struck by that question. It's like, what? Sorry.
Yeah, Ahab does not take the correction well. He's like a small child.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
Seems to continue into the next.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Nabal, Abigail, all that. The same kind of.
So you see, God uses kindness toward us to get us to repent, and then God uses correction to get us to repent. And you see both going here. And a lot of times people don't accept either one of them like they have.
Yep, that's right. Yeah, so God gives him a great reward, and he can't even trust him all the way to get the reward, right? And I think that's kind of part of the story that the prophet tells is like, look, I was going to get a talent of silver if I held on to him. And it's almost like the Lord is telling him, you didn't even want the blessing that I had to offer. You chose the justice, the judgment instead. So, yeah, very good. And Ahab will be a pouter. Pouter, not powder, but pouter. He will. One described this as he's resentful and angry. He's not penitent. And this is kind of like the person. Maybe they realize that they have done wrong, but they're not interested in turning from it. They're just mad at the consequences of it. They're mad at the judgment that's coming, or something like that. Okay. Anything else through chapter 20? Any comments or questions that you all have through chapter 20? We went through that quickly, but I think we get the sense of it all.
About the men who told him that his advisors were like, the kings of Israel are like this.
Yeah.
Like they knew he could be manipulated.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. That word there is merciful. And if you look at some other translations, the word is all over the place. Some say trustworthy, some say loyal. And you're like, what? So I was like, what in the world is going on with this word? So I looked it up, and it's Hesed, Hesed in English, which is, it's not in English, in our spelling, in our letters, Hesed. And that is the word that is used over and over and over and over and over and over and over in the Old Testament that means like loving kindness, when you in the old King James Version, or what does the English Standard Version say in that place? Like steadfast love, I think is the way it translates it. There's a lot of different ways that it's translated, but it's basically the word that God uses of himself over and over to talk about his loyal love. So it shouldn't be. I wish it wasn't. But it is kind of funny when a Syrian says, you know what the Israelite kings are like? Hesed. They're like they have God's loyal love and mercy. It's like, wait a second, which Israel kings have you been studying about? Because that's not any of them. But maybe in this sense, it's not supposed to have that technical definition. But I think any Jew reading this text would read Hesed, that is the word that describes God's faithful love, and would say, an Israelite king? Ha! Right? That's hilarious. And then we see Ahab is faithfully loving, but it's naive, it's shallow thinking, it's weak, and really it's not even meaningful, right? It's not going to help Ben-Hadad very much in the grand scheme of things.
To me, it's like they use flattery, or.
Yeah. Well, yeah, giving this opportunity to Ben-Hadad, to Ahab, like, hey Ahab, we can make a treaty. And Ahab's like, oh, yeah, great. That's a good idea. Instead of saying, look, I'm the one in power here because the Lord has helped me. He almost views this as like a self-victory and all of that. And then when the judgment comes down from it, he's upset because it's almost like he comes to the realization, oh, it wasn't all about me anyway. It was about the Lord accomplishing his will. And now Ahab, he doesn't get any credit for it. He doesn't get any praise for it. The Lord is not celebrating this because Ahab didn't do the job, really. Any other comments through chapter 20?
That's what happens to kings when they use pride instead of actually obedience to God.
Yeah, and that'll happen to kings in Judah as well, kings that God will specifically bless, and they will be exalted in pride, and they will do sinful things in the face of all of that. Okay, so Lord willing, next time we will pick up with chapter 21 and look at the situation of Naboth's vineyard. And then I believe we'll probably look at chapter 22 as well, but we'll have to connect it to Jehoshaphat. I don't know how far we'll make it, but 21 and 22. Sunday night is singing night, so Wednesday night we will do all of that. Thank y'all very much.
Thanks for watching. If you found this video to be beneficial, please follow us on Facebook or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Feel free to share it with others that you feel like may benefit from it. If you need to contact us, please contact us via email at quinn.church@yahoo.com. Also, if you're in the area, we would love for you to come visit with us at one of our assemblies. Have a good day.